So I see Jonathan Plucker is on here, and Jonathan is a colleague and friend of mine with whom I have had opportunities to work for quite a few years. Jonathan is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He coined the term excellence gap, and frankly, it's something we all need to know about. And he's also the current president of the National Association for Gifted Children. Welcome, Jonathan.
Good morning, Julia. How are you today?
Doing well. We thought it
Good.
would be a windy, rainy day, and I see sunshine out the office window. This is good news. Well, let's start out by you telling us, what is the excellence gap?
Yeah, I first want to start out by thanking everyone for having me this morning. And normal Saturday during a pandemic, rules apply. The odds of you seeing a teenager or a dog walk in front of or in back of me are probably about 75-25. So
And we're okay with
let's
that.
just roll with it. Yeah. But thank you for having me here today to talk about these topics. Excellence gaps, put very simply, are achievement gaps at advanced levels of the achievement spectrum. So we are very used to thinking about about achievement gaps now. We have been for about 20 odd years. They've sort of become part of the lexicon of education. But about 10 years ago, some colleagues and I were just talking about the fact that we have significant gaps at the most advanced levels of achievement too, and that those just don't get talked about very much. And so we coined the phrase excellence gaps, and we've been working on it for the past decade or so.
Well, I have a pretty blunt question. Why should I care about the excellence gap?
Well, you know, the way that I often talk to people about it, Julia, is that I think we have a moral and ethical imperative to close what I would consider to sort of be minimum competency achievement gaps. Like getting every student up to grade level is something that I just think morally we are obligated to do, and I know that every single teacher strives to do that every single day. But if we do that, that's not going to be the society game-changing achievement that I think lots of people expect it to be. It will, that will be good, but for a student who has the capability to go far beyond grade level, and we know so many of our students do, we shouldn't treat grade level as the finish line. It should be the minimum standard. It should be sort of the first mile marker on a much longer, much more important journey, if you will. And so if you have a low-income student, for example, who is just has lots of interest and passion for some aspect of, say, technology, getting them up to grade level is great, but that student can go so much further. What we know is that students from higher income backgrounds, white, certain groups of Asian students, they do tend to have those opportunities to push beyond grade level and really develop those talents and skills. But I would argue that most of our students actually do not. And that's where we see these excellence gaps occur, where students who have had these great opportunities just thrive. I mean, and that's why we're all interested in gifted advanced education talent development, right? Is that we want to see these students thrive. We love to see what happens when a student reaches their potential and how it transforms the child, how it transforms your classroom, how it can change that student's family, how it can change that family's community. But the problem that we've had in this country, and I think this summer it has been put into stark relief, is that there are some communities where students having the opportunities to reach that potential is just a very rare occurrence. And closing these excellence gaps, that's what's going to transform society much more so than getting every student to grade level, I think.
So who needs to be knowledgeable about excellence gaps in order to change the emphasis that we might see within a school or a school district?
Well, the short answer is everyone. I think it's really important for policymakers to certainly understand all of this. I think it's important for educational leaders to certainly understand all of this. And on the policymaker front, I think we've made progress over the past generation or so, people being sensitive to these issues. I think on the educational leader front, I think we're making progress. We hear from school districts now all across the country, literally almost every single week, saying, you know what, we'd never looked at our data before, we have excellence gap problems. What does the research say about how we can start fixing this? I think that's just tremendous progress. As I used to say when I was an elementary school teacher, Julia, if my principal had my back, it was amazing what I could do, to not have to worry about political pressures and things like that. I could take some risks, anything to help those kids. When you have educational leaders who aren't as supportive or don't understand what you're trying to do, it's just harder, right? It's just harder. It's harder to do everything as an educator. And then of course, we need classroom teachers to certainly understand what these issues are, studying the sorts of strategies that they're using and things like that. So, but then I should also say, we don't talk nearly enough about the important roles that school social workers, counselors, psychologists play. They often have great insights into a specific student's family situation, their strengths and weaknesses. Those are critical team members if we're going to close these excellence gaps. So that's the more long-winded way of saying it, but I will go back to my short answer. Everyone needs to be focused on this issue.
And I certainly agree with you, Jonathan. One of the things that we have done here in Kentucky, Mary Evans, Tracy Inman, and I have developed a module that's become a part of the Kentucky School Board Association training on the excellence gap. And I would tell you, when we have had opportunities to share that with school board members, they are all, I've never thought of that before, is the response that one gets. So sometimes we just need to get the information out to decision makers so they can support looking at advanced learning.
I mean, you can't underestimate the degree to which we've focused so much of education at every level, sort of, policy, federal policy, state policy, local policy, state leadership, local leadership, classroom leadership. So much of what we do is focused on grade level achievement. It is the fabric, it's the foundation of most of what we do. So I've met with plenty of educators who are super committed, incredibly talented people, would do anything for these students. And you talk about excellence gaps, and it's just not something they've ever thought about before. Everyone has these data, you just never look at it. No one asks you to look at it. No one requires you to look at it in most states. And so it just becomes, the unexamined life, right? If you're never looking at these data, if the whole system is built to encourage you not to think about these things, which is what we're trying to change here, right? Is to just be sensitive to it. It can be very, very transformative in school districts.
So, Jonathan, what data will tell the story if we look at it for our school district or for our school?
I mean, I do get this question a lot, Julia, and again, the short answer is any data you have. You're going to see excellence gaps in any data that you have. We generally use state test score data because it's ubiquitous. You have it for almost every single child, and you have it over multiple years in normal circumstances. Normal in quotes, right? So it's going to be different this year, obviously, and probably next year too. But I've also had people say, well, what if we used creativity scores, or what if we used data from this other test? And my answer is always, yeah, great. You're going to find big excellence gaps, and probably growing excellence gaps on any data source that you have. I think we can often overthink data, which I know as a researcher, I might lose my researcher card saying that, but we so overcomplicate these things sometimes. Just figure out what data is important to you and your students, use those data. If it's even just classroom grades, that's fine, as long as you're using those grades, you're examining them carefully, looking at where those gaps are. Any data that you have reasonable confidence in can be a very important tool here.
And so how prevalent are excellence gaps in the United States?
They're everywhere in every single school district. We do occasionally have people say, well, in my school district, we've totally figured this out. We generally pretend to be pleasantly surprised, and then later we dig up their data and they have excellence gaps that look like everybody else's. This is a pervasive problem. And again, given the history of economic and racial inequality in this country, gender inequality also, and the fact, again, that we've not really paid attention to this as we've reformed schools over the past 20 to 30 years, it's not really surprising that it's everywhere. It's one of those things where you finally shine a light on it and everyone goes, oh my gosh, this problem has been here the entire time, and we have totally missed it. And it's why in some ways I find it ironic when people, you see this every few years, there's another thing that becomes a really big deal, right? So like 12 years ago or so, it was, we need to improve high school graduation rates. People really started looking at high school graduation rate data, and they couldn't believe the number of Black, Hispanic, and low-income students, Native American students also, who weren't being counted in high school graduation numbers because they were dropping out of the system before we started counting. And everyone went, oh my gosh. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's partially an excellence gap issue. About a decade ago or so, when there was this big nationwide push to have our advanced placement classes within high school look like the rest of our student population. I mean, who can argue with that goal, right? And but people looked and were like, wow, we're not even close. That's an excellence gap issue. Some school districts around this country have been very successful in having their advanced high school coursework, having those demographics look like the rest of their student population. But then they would go to take the AP exams, and the scores were massively different. And everyone went, oh my gosh, how could this have happened? my response to these things usually is, how could these things not have happened? If we have excellence gaps from the time students start in school and we don't address them, of course the excellence gaps are going to be huge by the time students get to the end of high school and then into college. So it's just a matter of, again, looking and seeing that these problems are actually very, very pervasive.
So, what are strategies that we in districts and schools can put in place to work on this problem?
Um, uh, I will share a couple papers afterwards, Julia, that that we've just finished that kind of summarizes the last decade's worth of work, just so that everyone has some detailed information about strategies. I'm just going to highlight 3 of them that I thought we could talk about this morning. They're all things that you and I have talked about many, many times. And the first really is opportunity. We think of opportunity, and you've heard me tell this story before, but we think of opportunity from an upper middle class lens, which is that we know for our children that opportunity is everything. If you don't have opportunities, moving forward becomes very, very difficult in life. So any opportunity that we see, we know to reflexively grab that opportunity for our child. That's not necessarily a universal cultural value. And we've seen in like exit interviews from certain advanced programs are what the people will tell us, especially lower income families, they'll have access to the opportunity, but they won't seize the opportunity. And when they're interviewed about it afterwards, there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what the purpose of those programs are. Distrust in the government is at an all-time high. It is extremely severe. If you're a low-income Hispanic family and someone says, hey, come to this special Saturday or Sunday program or special after-school program, they don't see it necessarily as this excellent door to walk through for more opportunity. It could literally be a trap. And so creating equal opportunity is part of it, but then really working with families and students to get them to understand the nature of the opportunity, that it's safe, that it's a good thing. Essentially moving from our middle class lens to their lens, which may or may not be very, very different. We're finding increasingly that that is very, very important. So the first piece is definitely opportunity. The second piece is we've learned so much in the last 4 to 5 years about identifying advanced students, identifying gifted and talented students. The big one that I think everyone here is probably familiar with is universal screening. Any sort of a nomination approach almost immediately starts to miss students and grow excellence gaps. So if you're going to look at data for every student. The big pushback to that is usually cost. And there are super fancy technical ways that you can do it. I favor, grabbing whatever data you can, as long as you have the data on every single student. That's the most important part. Study after study after study tells us that alone will help you find more, especially low-income students who are already performing at high levels, but people just really haven't noticed yet. So universal screening is a huge piece. Another piece, and this is kind of related to that nomination issue, is when you collect teacher data is incredibly, incredibly important. Studies have shown that if you have teachers sort of dominate the early part of the identification process, it tends to have fairly biased nomination results. This has led several of my colleagues to say that there shouldn't be any teacher input at all when you're trying to find talented students. As a former classroom teacher, that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Other than the parents, who knows the students best? It's going to be the educators who are working with them every single day. So teacher input is critically important. What I've seen some districts do, though, is that they use teachers not as screeners, not as gatekeepers, but as safety nets. I love that, if for no other reason than no one went into teaching to be a gatekeeper. Every teacher I know, in some way, shape, or form, sees part of their responsibility as being a safety net, is to make sure students don't fall through those cracks, helping every student who needs it. So I think thinking of teachers less as screeners and more as safety nets during identification processes not only works better, not only helps find students that you wouldn't normally find, it also fits with why we all want to be educators. So it makes a lot more sense in that regard. So for example, in one school district that I was in, they do their universal screening and they get their pool of students. The last stage in their identification process is to then sit down with every single classroom teacher, show them their students' results, point out who the universal screener identified, but then they ask the most important question: who did the universal screening miss? And every single teacher that I observed in this one district was able to nominate at least one student that the universal screener had missed. It was often students whose first language was not English. It was almost always a low-income student. It was just really powerful to see the teacher say, oh, well, the most talented kid that I have is so-and-so, and for whatever reason, they did not do well at all on this. You should really give them a much closer look. So using teachers in that way, I think, is really, really important. So opportunity, identification, and then, of course, preparation. We know that African American, Hispanic, low-income students, Native American students, by the time they reach us in kindergarten, we already see excellence gaps. Some studies suggest that the gaps are already there and pretty much stay the same for the next 13 years. This makes perfect sense, right? Like if you haven't had the right preparation, if you haven't had a very high quality preschool situation, you're going to be behind, and we absolutely need additional interventions to help those students catch up. My colleagues and I generally call that front loading. I've heard a lot of different names for it. I don't care what you call it, just do it. And the best example would be, there's one school district in Virginia. There are actually several who use this basic model where they identify those students. I just saw the question, not as gatekeepers, but rather as safety nets, to answer the question that was just asked. You identify students who seem to have potential based on data, based on teacher observations, but aren't performing, maybe not even at grade level, but making sure that those students are identified, that each teacher knows who they are, and that basically that they receive a more rigorous curriculum, set of instruction, just a more rigorous set of academic experiences. Basically, the mechanism we think is that it raises everyone's expectations for those for those children, excuse me. And we don't have a lot of data on these programs. The few studies that we have suggest that that in as few as, believe it or not, 2 to 3 years, those students generally catch up to their higher income peers. So it's not like we've got to spend 20 years and $1 million to help these kids catch up. It certainly appears that these really talented kids who just have not been challenged, once they get that challenge, they have such a thirst to excel that they very quickly catch up. And what most of these studies find is that 2 to 3 years later, if you ask teachers who was being front loaded and who wasn't, most of the time in these studies, teachers can't tell the difference. That's exactly how this should work. You're essentially making up for opportunities that the child never got for whatever reason. We could talk for hours about why that happens, right? But the fact is that it does. So if you front load, it tends to really, really help. So for our purposes this morning, there are lots of other strategies, but thinking differently about opportunity, thinking differently about identification, and making front-loading a priority in every single school. If we could get every school district to focus on those 3 things, I really do believe it would be transformative for the country.
And I'm going to encourage anyone to put a question in the chat if you have one that you would like for Jonathan to address for us. Jonathan, I know I've heard you talk about some research that was done that indicates that far more kids score above grade level than we have really ever known. Would you share just a bit of information about that?
Yeah, and I can share just a short summary of that work afterward too, to Julia, which will be helpful for people. Just a very quick anecdote. I was talking to some colleagues once, and we were looking at, it was when the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed into law, and lots of gifted education advocates worked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to make that law, which used to be NCLB, the No Child Left Behind Act, to make it more advanced education friendly. And the law absolutely does that. It's a huge policy victory. The problem is the regulations, which is what really matters, don't mention it at all, which is a gigantic fail. And but it is what it is, right? And we were looking over the regulations one day, and I was just, to be perfectly honest, furious. I could not believe that all that work had turned into almost nothing. And I just started complaining wildly to my colleagues. And one person said, and I was especially talking about the fact that, so many students come to school knowing all that they're going to be taught during the next year, if you look at state grade level standards. And my colleague let me rant for a while, and then she just very calmly said, wow, this is a huge problem. What percentage of students actually do come to school knowing all of the standards? And I realized I couldn't answer that question, which was really embarrassing. And so I did what we all do. I went and I immediately emailed the smartest people that I knew who had lots of data and said, tell me the answer so I can use this. And they all came back and said, you know what, I don't know that answer either. But they did exactly what I hoped they would do. They fell into my trap, Julia. They all said, but here's how I would answer it. And so we went out, we got some money to fund that study, and we went out and we got that number. My guess, when that colleague first asked me, was that about 15% of students showed up on the first day of school already having shown that they had already provided evidence, usually on state tests, that they had mastered the following year's standards. And what we found was that the percentage in, we did it for reading and we did it for math. The percentage in reading who start the school year 3 or more grade levels above was 15%, which was jaw-dropping to say the least. And it's about, depending on how you measure these things, it looks like it's about 20 to 25%. States have different cutoffs for different standards. So in some states, in some grades, we found out it was as high as 40 to 45%. So just think about that. In some of these were big states. We looked at almost every single state in some way, shape, or form. 45% of your students, almost half, show up to the first day of, say, 4th grade and are already learning at the 5th or 6th grade level, and about 1 in 4 are at the 7th or 8th grade level. I mean, that is just a stunning miscalibration of how we do curriculum, etc. And so it was just mind-blowing for us. And before anyone asks, we looked at all different types of tests, all different sorts of data sets, state data sets, national data sets, and we got roughly the same percentages, no matter how we did it, whether it was an adaptive test, a norm reference test, computerized, pencil and paper, state, national. We got roughly the same numbers. The numbers are a little lower in math, and the reason why we think they're, in some ways, they should be higher in math, right? Because it's actually easier, in general, people believe it's easier to do things like accelerate within math, which has a more standardized sort of curriculum in this country. The numbers were considerably lower, and the reason why we think that happens is that everybody is comfortable differentiating, at least informally, with reading language arts, right? You don't need to know anything about education, but if your child is flying through books at their grade level, what do?
Move them up.
It's a no-brainer, right? You just get some more complex books, and everyone's comfortable with that. How many of you, if your kid came home and was like, gosh, this grade level math is really easy, how many of you have a bunch of, advanced algebra books on your bookshelf where you go, oh, okay, well, let's start doing linear algebra at home then? That doesn't happen very often. So part of it is we're just more comfortable with reading and language as far as acceleration than we are with math. There's no reason why those math numbers couldn't be just as high. So yeah, those numbers are absolutely staggering. And it's something that we really need to be focusing on. And it's made me a pretty big fan of ability grouping. It's made me a very big fan of acceleration, both of which, despite what the conventional wisdom says, are very research-supported interventions. And it's certainly made me a fan of sort of a pre-differentiated curriculum. I do think we place an unfair burden on educators, Julia, when we expect them to make their own curriculum and also differentiate it within a non-ability group scenario where they may have 10 to 11 grade levels of student performance sitting in their classroom. Some studies have found that the average elementary school classroom has 7 to 9 grade levels of student performance. that is just an incredible instructional burden for teachers. You could be the best teacher in the entire world. I don't know how you do 9 or more grade levels. That is a huge spread. And then to be asking those teachers to develop curriculum for all those different levels, I mean, it's almost impossible. We are setting teachers up to be very, very frustrated. Let's give teachers a break and help them out with ability grouping to narrow those performance ranges, but then also help them create very high quality, pre-differentiated sort of adaptive curriculum. We're seeing progress in those areas in spots around the country, but we have a long way to go there. So
it certainly takes leadership in a school or a district to make that happen.
Absolutely. And you just reminded me of something, and I'm going to rant for about 30 seconds here, but I increasingly hear educational leaders say things like, if this is good for gifted students, advanced students, talented students, we should be doing it for everyone. And my response to that is, if it works for everyone, yeah, you absolutely should be. But you probably shouldn't be using it with your gifted and your advanced students, because that means it's not advanced education. It means that it works for everyone. The whole purpose of gifted education, advanced education, talent development programs is to provide a level of challenge that students wouldn't otherwise receive. So by definition, if what you're doing actually would benefit every student, then it's not gifted education anymore, right? Right. And I'm starting to hear this more and more and more. And I think we really have to push back hard on that. In some ways, it's a very anti-intellectual trope. And it can really be used to create a climate that is anti-intellectual. And so we really have to fight that. And let's be honest, in this country right now, there are lots of anti-intellectual forces. So we have to be ready to push back on these things whenever we can. Rant over. I promise that'll be my last rant.
Well, I am so glad to have you here, and I'm glad for you to share information that would suggest to all of us why it is so incredibly important to get rid of the excellence gap, but why it's so very important that we're actively involved in ensuring that children have the opportunity to learn what it is they're ready to learn. And unless we look at data, pre-assessment data, or other data that we have, that won't be happening. Jonathan, thank you ever so much for joining us on a Saturday morning.
Of course. Always nice to interact with my friends from the Commonwealth. So thank you very much. And I will work with Tyler, everybody, to get you some of the documents that Julie and I have been talking about this morning.
That would be great. It will be useful to all of us.